They say love is the best thing in life, but I say it's a fresh pie on your plate, especially the ones that time itself tried to take away. But they're just too good to lose, so make sure to stick with me for 2 hours of pie perfection you won't forget this time. Osgood pies were the height of America's experimental phase of adding all kinds of fruits like pecans and raisins to the mixture and using them as fillings. Single crust pies and simple ingredients equaled a pie that stuck to traditional flavors but did them really well. Hanging close to your roots and nailing the execution is the story behind many great recipes across history, and Osgood pies were no different from the rest in that regard. Maybe you might remember coming over to your aunt's to a tray of this? Puffy and soft slices of the most savory but sweet dessert that put a pep back in your step. No aunt these days would be baking a fashionable old Osgood now, though. The raisin pie is a common dessert. It was most popular as a funeral dish in Amish communities, especially because it didn't require preservation, freeing up hands for other work. There are variations on how to prepare it, but most agree that a double crust topped with a lattice is essential. If you were to draw a mental image, think of a mincemeat pie with raisins and a thicker crust. The pie gained somewhat of a bad reputation because of its association with funerals. Some considered it to be a bad omen, and so it lost its popularity amongst masses. Maybe the next time you need to bring something to a funeral, you can keep this in mind. You might have heard of bread and butter pudding, but the pie form is less common now. From the 12th century to the 21st, this staple of the populaces has gone through relentless change. The version that has vanished, however, is the bread and butter pudding pie. A rather confusing mix of pie crust with pudding, this pie was well loved amongst English and American crowds in the 1900s. Much like the name suggests, it was a fusion of pie crust with a custard filling made out of bread and butter pudding. It met its downfall, however, as people preferred the iconic pudding form over a pie that could not be consumed in one sitting. It had a short run amongst the people and became a weird combination that was forgotten in history. Southern buttermilk pie is no real exception. It was a family classic that many home chefs perfected over the span of their time as a chef. It was typically kept only for holidays, gatherings, and celebrations, but over time it even became popular as a casual dish that families would prepare when it had been a while since they last saw each other. Did you ever know how buttermilk got so popular as a pie ingredient, though? It's actually because of butter making in general. The milk was literally just a side effect of the process, but farmers thought it could turn a neat little profit if they started selling that too. They didn't know they'd be handing the keys to an entirely new kingdom of culinary mysteries to people when they first did it. Since then, people have added all kinds of things to buttermilk pies to get newer flavors out of it. Vanilla extracts, lemon zest, berries, maple syrup, you name it. A buttermilk pie out there is probably based around it. This pie was more so a hack for people to use up unripe tomatoes that grew in their gardens, back when gardening was less of a hobby and more of a job for many Americans. The forgotten green tomato pie was made with cinnamon, spices of the creator's choice, flour, raisins, and sliced green tomatoes. It was all cooked upon a stovetop before the pie was transferred into a pastry dish to be baked. Sometimes cloves would also be added, and this pie would turn into a savory lunch. Many upper-class people would add mincemeat as they could afford to include a protein into the dish. This is a pie you definitely won't hear about much anymore because it faded into obscurity, and there hasn't been any reason to revive it since. Coconut cream pie was a Hawaiian hit that the rest of the US just had to get in on too. Bakers there were one of the first to do it with coconut cream fillings and toppings instead of your usual assortment of pies. Coconuts became something Americans were more prone to eating around the 70s, since tropical fruits were slowly becoming more and more of a thing. When something is the new hot thing in town, businesses will naturally see where they can start making their buck in the middle of all of it. Bakeries did the same, and so we had coconut cream pies, and honestly, we would give our money too, and happily. Coconut cream pies were not really the best pick for a celebration, but they were the top choice for a solo date with a pie and your favorite movie on rent. People do not rent movies nowadays anymore, though, nor do they eat coconut cream pies much even in Hawaii. Here is hoping tropical fruit-based pies will make a strong comeback. Vinegar pies shook the baking world up at the start of the 1970s as bakeries started serving the odd pie across the states. Bakers began adding vinegar to the dough whilst also using a vinegar filling, topping it off with whipped cream. Bakeries did this because the vinegar gave the texture of the crust a pretty noticeable glow-up, while also adding a unique tartness to the pie. Usually, apple cider vinegar and brown sugar would be used to balance each other out, and the aroma as well as the set of flavors made this a holiday favorite. Everyone can remember their grandma enthusiastically coming out of the kitchen with a fat vinegar pie on Thanksgiving, right? For Americans who wanted to be whisked away to days when they were 7 and nothing mattered except hearing the school bell ringing, this pie was the one. America found other ways to have nostalgia trips eventually, and vinegar pies are now just a forgotten classic. Let's talk a little more about history, since this next one is truly as old as America itself. Popularized most in the 1940s, apple pies truly became a hallmark dessert in American traditions. Nobody can think of the United States without thinking about apple pies, Uncle Sam's very own favorite throughout the decades. Maybe it has fallen out of daily vocabulary nowadays, but back in the 1930s, the phrase "as American as apple pie" was widely used. Actually, it was even popularly used in the 19th century. Just like people think of rock and roll, baseball, and root beers when they think of our country, apple pies go along with a white picket fence almost as well as red and blue on the American flag. Still, that leaves the question of where and when exactly it got its reputation. You would be surprised, but apples were not really native to the land when America was first formed, and our forefathers did not just start pushing out pies after the Declaration of Independence. Apple pie was something that the first European settlers introduced to the country, and it would consist of a simple crust with apples baked into the pie. The cultural fabric of America's food scene cannot be analyzed without taking into consideration apple pie, which continues to be a Christmas favorite of many households even today. It was definitely much more in its element during the 1940s, though. Apple pie's long-held claim to fame does not lie in its flavor or that it is easy to make, but that it gives you a genuinely bakery-level dish with a list of ingredients that are accessible to the entire population. Everywhere during fall was plum pie. People would make it to get through the summer and enjoy the start of fall, and it was why a lot of fruit orchards were in business. They still are, you just see a lot less of them because everything can be bought in a store in a can now. Back then, it was still common to go to fruit orchards and get your produce right there. Plum in general was something that never stuck for kids, but mostly for the older middle-aged audience with a more refined taste. Fig pie is kind of the same, except it's not really a pie that you would have found in America before the country decided to venture on a culinary quest to find out new flavors from abroad. Fig pie really took off when Spanish immigrants brought it over in the 18th century, but after that, it faded into irrelevance until the 1960s and 70s. Maybe it took that long for the taste of fig to come back into rotation for Americans? Either way, there were a few states that really didn't play about their fig pie, like Louisiana or Mississippi. There, you'd always get an amazing fig pie no matter the time of the year. This was especially true if you were a part of your local church communities. Back then, churches still used to host potlucks really regularly, and one of the most common dishes at these potlucks would be a sweet fig pie. You would even have dried fig pie because dried figs had a much thicker filling. Some people in Georgia would enjoy white fig pies instead of the normal ones, but when a dish has 5 different versions and church support, you know it's been popping off with everyone. Some of the 2000s versions of fig pies use goat cheese and balsamic reduction, but if you want a purely 1920s variant with all its authenticity, then the simpler you go with the ingredients, the better. Speaking of buttery pies, let's talk about the grapefruit meringue pie, which was one of the propellers of meringue pies in America, and your grandparents played no small part in that. Citrusy, creamy, and sour but fruity, this pie had an incredibly diverse range of flavors, giving it an edge over other pies in the game. It stood out for all the right reasons, and the aroma called to you every time, especially if it was coming from your grandmother's house as you got out of the car. Golden brown tart lemon layers with the sweetest, thickest meringue you could imagine on top, and some fresh grapefruits right from the market was about as good as being a kid could get in the 20th century. The cottage cheese pie found its footing in America due to its unique texture and flavor, which resembles a fragrance similar to fresh nutmeg. Its versatility as either breakfast, dessert, or even a Saturday brunch option paired with its relatively straightforward recipe made it a hit. Though it did have its most famous days in the 1930s-60s. The decline in its popularity was mostly because of changing tastes and fast food culture. There's just less of a focus on the morning breakfast or brunch at some comfy cafe type of lifestyle now. This delicious piece of history was made using 15 ounces of cottage cheese, flour, sugar, 1 grated lemon, milk or cream, and a pie crust, which you can make from scratch or use store-bought ones. Buttermilk coconut pies were usually 9-inch pie crusts filled with this rich, thick buttermilk custard that had these tropical notes of coconut accompanying it. Most people in the 1900s had this locked down and would regularly make it, passing the recipe on to their kids so that they could make it for their children one day. You cannot teach your grandmother to suck eggs, though, and neither can you teach her how to make a better coconut pie. Whether it was the amount of buttermilk, the flaky but crumbly crust, or the custard filling that lured you into an incredibly peaceful food coma is beyond us. Buttermilk coconut pies had it all, though, and no one knew what the secret was. Was it how they beat the eggs to perfection, or the small window of a few seconds between perfectly golden brown and overdone? Either way, making one of these was like a Tuesday afternoon reflex to many grannies. Shoofly pie is a pie that first got its start in America's food history in Pennsylvania Dutch country as the go-to for when people had a crumb craving. Wanted a pie that had a crunchy crust and a crumb-filled topping? Shoofly pie was on speed dial and also on every bakery shelf in the 70s, just waiting to arrive at your doorstep. A molasses filling inside a sizable crust was the apple of every Pennsylvania resident's eye, and soon the infection would spread. People from every state started adopting their own versions of shoofly pies, although when the itch came for an authentic, flavorful shoofly, a road trip to Pennsylvania was in order. I guess when a dish boosts tourism for your state, you can officially consider it good. Those same folks now visit for other reasons since shoofly have flown away from bakeries. A basic custard pie just takes eggs and milk and makes a filling out of that. The pie crust isn't anything too out of the ordinary either. It's a pretty tame dish, all things considered. Cookbooks in the 19th century in America, like The Virginia Housewife by Mary Randolph, first started including different versions of the egg custard pie, like including a thickener or using cinnamon and nutmeg. It became really popular in the South, more than anywhere else. This is something you'll hear a lot of throughout the video, because a good pie is always appreciated twice as much more down in the South. It also kind of had the competition beat in the price department. You just need eggs and milk to make this? And a pastry crust you can buy at any store around the block? That's a steal. Soon, the custard pie started getting so popular that it introduced new dishes entirely like the chess and buttermilk pies we went over a while ago. Persimmon pies were something that kids and food conservatives really had to open their minds and hearts to, but once they did, they were on the bandwagon faster than anyone. Persimmons are a really ripe, juicy fruit that are popularly grown in the southern and western parts of America. Places like Oklahoma, Florida, and Iowa had bakeries that would stuff their shelves full of a fragrant batch of these pies, and they sold like hotcakes. Also, they strangely appealed more to 40 to 50-year-olds, so it was the ideal thing to bring for your dad or uncle. Some foods work amazingly well as gifts, and persimmon pies were definitely one of those. Presently, people have a much different idea of what a tasty gift means, and persimmon pies do not fit the bill anymore. Now here's a proper vintage one off of the history shelf. Gooseberry pies actually go back all the way to the kitchens of the 1700s, where they were still the delight of bakers and grandmas across the country. Local town bakers would make smaller and more plain versions of these, while they were a very trendy choice for local fairs and baking contests. While you might think that a lot of Americans do not favor the gooseberry too much, that definitely took a turn in the 20th century when it started being a snack for people in rural southern areas and urban Midwest ones. This also meant that it would eventually pave the way for it to be centered in the world of baking, and gooseberries were all you needed besides some water and stevia. Also, instead of all-purpose flour, eventually around the 1980s it became more common to use tapioca flour. If you have had this, do you remember how your family used to make it? Let's move on to the 1970s with mud pies, which first became extremely popular in Mississippi and soon all of the United States of America as the chocolate pie of the entire nation. The reason it was called a mud pie was because the really dark brown, gooey chocolate sauce reminded natives of the state of the muddy banks of the Mississippi River, which is a really cute story if you think about kids playing next to the river, then coming back home for a fresh hot mud pie. Luckily, it tastes a lot better than the inspiration for its naming choices, nothing at all like mud, don't you worry. Typically, you have a chocolate custard served in a crumbly chocolate crust, and some people really take the caloric aspect of the dish to an all-time high with servings of ice cream, whipped cream, or vanilla yogurt. It was firstly only associated with the south of the USA, but that was not the case for too long. Some variations of the dish strayed a lot from the original, even involving liquor. A lemon icebox pie is one of those widely considered lucky breaks in American history. It actually is a symbol of some outdated technology because it was from the era that came before modern refrigeration. Back then, people had to use these containers filled with ice to keep things chilled and preserve the flavor. This was really true in the South, where the heat often meant that desserts were often enjoyed warm too. This was pretty true for most kinds of lemon pies. People just thought if you were having one, it was probably going to be a warm one, but nothing really beats a cool pie, you know? There's something about that which takes the edge off of a hard week. Icebox pies in general were the answer to that desperate want before modern fridges made life monumentally easier for everyone else. They built all pies around the icebox too because these pies were baked in a way which let them firm up while they were sitting in the icebox. Anyway, back to the lemon pie, which we aren't exactly too sure about who created it, but we do know it was the star of any summer one spent in the South. Especially in the 1920s and 30s, where lemons were one of the few precious things that inflation hadn't robbed from the people. The transparent pie was a Kentucky specialty that wasn't widely known outside the region. Before its decline, it was particularly a holiday favorite. The pie would often get confused with chess pies from the South or pecan pies, but they really just look alike more than anything else. You might find the name misleading, as the pie is not actually totally transparent, but more of a beige-ish off-white color. It rose to fame because exotic ingredients were harder to get in Kentucky during the 1800s, so home bakers in small towns turned towards easily obtainable ingredients to create the transparent pie. Conventionally, it would be made with ingredients like sugar, flour, eggs, butter, whipping cream, vanilla extract, brown and white sugar, a jelly filling, and just a bit of bourbon to make for a state classic. Vegetable pie recipes go all the way back to Europe, but this is about America, so let's stick to the Cliff Notes version of our history tour. Sweet potato pie actually got very popular in the southern parts of the USA during the colonial era, when America was still a colony under the British Empire. Sweet potatoes had always been used by Southern folk in their desserts. Initially, the vegetable was popularized by Black American households that spread their magic across the nation. It gets more interesting, though, as word is they got the idea from Native American cooking practices. Basically, the rabbit hole of who made it first can go deep, but none of that matters when you consider how cost-effective and delicious this pie is. Potatoes in general were becoming the top most consumed vegetable, and to find a way to incorporate it into a dessert for the masses is cooking talent at its finest. We all love a good chiffon pie cake, and grandmas are known to get pretty busy with them, especially if it is for a special occasion. We are not sure if Halloween comes into that for you, but for many kids in the late 1900s to 2000s, you could not celebrate October's finest activity without pumpkin chiffon pie. Made with a custard filling that used pumpkin and mixed with egg whites beaten to sheer, creamy perfection, gave the pie a fluffy meringue-like texture that really did justice to the chiffon genre of desserts. Plus, the granulated sugar brought out the best within the pumpkin. Grandmas all around had perfected the art of making sure the gelatin mixed as well as it could with the egg whites, and that is what made their pies so incredibly airy and weightless. The thing about a classic chess pie is you can never go wrong with it. People would use to pass around phrases like "it's just pie," with just changing to chess as both the board game and fish got a bit more popular than they started out as. A chess pie makes use of some pretty day-to-day ingredients, so you don't really need to think too much here. Just put your mitts on and let's get baking. You might be wondering what this dish really has to do with chess, though. And well, the honest answer is nothing. There isn't a real explanation for why the chess moniker stuck to it. But one theory was that when people in medieval England used to ask about what kind of pie this was, bakers would typically respond by saying it was just pie. You know how words got distorted over time? I mean, just look at Gen Z. Eventually, the same thing happened, and this became known as chess pie. It was one of the first things to really make a lot of use of cornmeal, vinegar, and lemon juice, so if we talk about chess, this dish was played 5 steps ahead of the game. These were ingredients that would make up the majority of pie making in a lot of countries, not just America. Continuing on with more desperation food that actually worked, we have buttermilk pies. What if we told you pies could be tangy, sweet, and extremely cheap? Buttermilk pies were one hell of an all-rounder in the 1970s because they gave you everything for like $3. All you needed were very simple staples of any pantry and some vanilla custard paired with a butter pie crust. Sometimes, if people could spare the money, they would get some lemon zest juice and sprinkle a few drops to boost the tang of the dish. This pie was a favorite of so many homes and a regular of birthdays, parties, celebrations, and holidays of all kinds. Ask your parents to take a trip down memory lane to their favorite foods, and we will bet you money they will mention this. When times got much better, people made fancier and more complex versions of this pie, but the OG still stands on its own 2 feet, even if it is gone now. Much like the Marlboro pie, gooseberry pie was also famous in Europe before they found their footing in America. It's a rather unknown pie now because gooseberries were becoming less common, leading to a decline in this pie's popularity. But when it was prepared, the pie used fresh gooseberries with the ends either removed or trimmed, 1/4 cup of a potato, and any pie crust available. The ingredient list seems odd, but it would make for a perfect pie. Many would wonder why this pie went out of fashion, and the answer is simple. With the increase of pies like strawberry and apple pies, using a fruit like gooseberry, which is expensive and not readily available, became more of a hassle. Ultimately, this pie disappeared from American cuisine. Mock apple pies were maybe the top 5 foods to come out of the Great Depression era. Everything about this pie was meant to imitate the feeling, texture, and taste of a good old-fashioned apple pie, but without the costs of one. In the trenches of the Depression era, basic nutrition and fruits became a rarity, and people really only had so much to work with. What came out of those times were a bunch of copies of very beloved foods that Americans were able to afford just a year or 2 ago. Mock cuisine soon took over a lot of neighborhoods, and mock apple pies made their home in dozens of fridges. Instead of sliced apples, people used Ritz crackers, and the taste and appearance matched an apple pie almost entirely, especially as folks got better at capturing the essence of one, although of course it could not beat the original, and since people's wallets would start feeling better soon, it disappeared. Lastly, the 2010s were a time marked by health consciousness and a focus on ensuring that everyone could participate in activities like eating. If you got to the end of this list without even a single pie that you could eat, or if you did want to eat many of them, but found yourself unable to because of some pesky allergies, then we are glad we are ending it this way specifically for viewers like you. Allergen-friendly pies were all the rage in the 2010s, especially as food allergies became better understood, leading to the rise in allergen-friendly foods. As a result, we had pies that now used wholly gluten-free pie shells and organic cane sugar, or rice flour, as well as vegan butter. A strong focus on all natural ingredients that had very little tampering done to them also made people go for them even if they did not have allergies just because they seemed healthier. You could make a sick apple or chocolate mud pie with these, and it would pass just as well as any other baked goodness you have had. That's 100. Gooseberry pie just isn't something you would see anymore these days. It's not that the taste faded out or there isn't an audience for that kind of flavor anymore. There definitely is. It was widely enjoyed throughout America, especially in rural places with strong ties to agriculture. The tart was made of these perfect gooseberries and just had one thickener, all being baked into a fluffy crust. It was a very early 19th century recipe, and you honestly just had to be there for when this was in its heyday. If you went to some corners in New England that are really into retro cooking, you would still find a lot of love for this dish, also because we just don't have enough gooseberry representation in American cooking in general. It's a shame it went out on its last legs in the early 20th centuries, because summers back then weren't even a quarter as bad as they are today. Seriously, why did they get all the summer recipes when we're the ones facing heat strokes every June and July? The goodness of a peanut butter cream pie does not have to end at just the ones you get from Little Debbie's, at least not for a lot of families that grew up with the confection. It was a very balanced harmony of flavors that were a bit unfamiliar when you thought about the fact that they are in a pie, but it made them work just as well as any other classic. Peanut butter and cream cheese will surprisingly go very well together. There are even no bake versions, which make it a lot easier to whip this up or even get a batch going. Actually, most pies in this list have no bake versions, and one thing you will notice even with this one is that a lot of them are incredibly easy to make. Not at all as complicated as the show-stopping desserts of today, perhaps keeping it simple is where the real magic lies. After all, nothing ever went wrong with an extra helping of peanut butter. Wilma Tidwell is one popular name in cooking circles in America if you keep an ear out and know who she is. She was famous for a lot of recipes, and the iconic chocolate chip pie is no exception. She's the reason this dish has its style and substance, which separates it from just any other old chocolate chip dish. It was really popular at all kinds of potlucks. People who would organize big family events and wanted to save costs by catering themselves would make a lot of use of Wilma Tidwell's legendary recipes. Have you ever heard of word-of-mouth promotion? The next time someone at your workplace or during a heated online argument brings up whether or not it works, you can give this pie as an example. Its popularity was entirely, and I mean completely, sustained by word of mouth. People wouldn't ever stop talking about it, and I mean, sure, the initial news of the pie may have gotten around better thanks to community cookbooks, but it took one person to read about it, and by the next day, 10 others in the neighborhood knew about it, and 5 were trying to get the recipe down. This pie was really special to Americans because chocolate chip cookies were already a massive thing in every corner of American life. Stopping for a quick sandwich at Subway? Why not grab a chocolate chip cookie on your way out? Got a date? Nothing better than some chocolate chip goodness. Need to feel better with some sugar binging? You know what to do. So it wasn't really just the South that loved this pie. It was everywhere. If you look at a lot of the food in the South, you'll find the impact of buttermilk everywhere. Possum pie was a regional specialty in Arkansas. If the name seems unheard of, that might be because this pie was not widely known outside the region. Back in the 1970s, the possum pie was all the rage in Arkansas. It was popularized by its mention in a 1983 restaurant review in Arkansas Gazette, naming the pie to be one of the best things Arkansas has to offer. Before its popularity died down, you'd be able to spot this pie in bakeries because of its distinct crumb crust and big size, due to its several layers. By several, we mean a lot of layers of chocolate, vanilla, cream cheese, and even whipped cream. This nut crumb crust pudding pie, however, started seeing its downfall around the 2000s when food critics started frowning upon heavy and extremely sweet desserts. As less people bought the possum pies, less bakeries created it, thus leading to the ultimate downfall of this treat. PB&J sandwiches ran so peanut butter pies could run, and boy did they dash. Around 1975, strangely, a craving took over the masses for peanut butter in all things they were having. Now, pies were never too far off on the horizon, and America was already brainstorming in the kitchen often enough with all kinds of fusion foods and different cuisines. Peanut pie itself was widely eaten in America already, so the stage was completely set for the birth of the peanut butter pie. Hitting bakeries around towns around 1976 and onwards, these double-crust pies filled with very thick and creamy peanut butter were heaven on a platter. Often families would go way overboard with the amount of filling, but who could blame them? Combos with peanut butter would keep continuing in America, and although this one did really well, it would soon get overshadowed. Toffee apple pies with dulce de leche are a lot more modern in comparison. Though these chefs took an interest in Argentinian culture, which makes a lot of use of dulce de leche so that the flavor and texture of a pie can be enhanced. It was seen as a fusion dessert by the global community because it took Latin and British influences and mixed them in one dish. In America, it got popular because it made a lot of use of spiced apples and caramelized milk spreads. Caramel was a flavor that America already deeply admired. Spiced apples were a very old-school American snack, so it's no wonder this dish took off as well as it did. You usually don't associate cocktails with your pies, right? But to understand this one, we really need to look at one of dating back to the mid-1800s. Mock apple pie first came into being during the wintertime. The season of winter would often bring scarcity of fruits. One such fruit was apples. So the bakers at the time turned towards creating a pie closest to apple pie, but without apples. Hence the name mock apple pie. Known for its clever use of Ritz crackers to mock the texture of apples, it was also surprisingly budget-friendly. In the 1900s, when the popularity of crackers increased, mock apple pie seemed to be a fan favorite. This pie used ingredients like breadcrumbs, sugar, cinnamon, water, lemon, and crackers. The surprising part was, people could not tell that this pie did not include apples at all. But as food companies started producing fruits that could be sold all year round, the need for a mock apple pie decreased, resulting in it being sidelined for a real apple pie. Chess pies are similar to both Osgood pies and Jefferson pies, but they leave out the meringue and creamy toppings for an even fundamental flavor profile. Simply put, chess pies are all about taking the basic ingredients that make a pie and nailing them completely. The most liberty this dish takes is some vanilla and tart lemon juice, which we mean, come on, we just talked about literal fried pies. A very do one thing but do it right type of pie. It was an incredible choice for gentlemen who love to go to parlors and pubs for a round of chess. As you can guess, that is also where it got its name because they would order chess pies over a few rounds. Today, both chess pies and the game it gets its identity from are things that were much more popular in the 70s. Moving on to the chocolate pudding pies that became popular in the 1980s. Remember how we just talked about recipes being deeply beloved because they were accessible to the general public? Well, when the general public begins healing from a lot of economic pitfalls and droughts, they also tend to splurge a little bit. Chocolate pudding was an example of that, but when the widespread consumption of pudding led to pudding pie, we all thanked God just a little bit more than yesterday. Pudding was originally thought to be a dessert only for the upper class and the wealthy, but in the 1980s it became something that was readily available to a lot more than just the blue-collar workforce and their families. Chocolate and vanilla pudding pies took center stage as they would use puddings for the filling in crusts made out of crushed cookies or graham crackers. Some would use shortbread or buttery pastries, and eventually people started incorporating more tropical flavors like strawberry and blueberry pudding as well. Extremely popular in states like Oregon was the purple plum pie, which sounds as appetizing as it actually is. People would use branded canned purple plums or homegrown ones and layer black plum slices to give an incredibly deep purple color, along with a very vivid texture. Think of it like a tart cherry pie that you could really sink your teeth into, where the food just seems to melt perfectly in your mouth. In terms of syrup, most people thought to keep it plain and simple with just a good and proper lavender syrup because it really brought out the vanilla extract in the pie. Plum pies were always a big hit in America, but this dish took it a step further and solidified them as one of the many gems of the 1900s. The fact that it literally looks like a gem, if you get a bit creative with the layering, does not help at all. Mississippi mud pie has a funny story to its name. If you haven't grown up around the banks of the Mississippi River, then you wouldn't know it or be able to catch it either. The banks of that river are known for their extremely dark muddy color, more so than any other river, and the reason we call it this is because the mud pie resembles exactly the same shade. It's probably in the 20th century during the post-World War II era where this dish really took off. The first versions I could find talk a lot about just being a simple chocolate filling and a crust, like a pretty dense and thick fudge cake, but later ones even use marshmallows and ice cream. They also have a newfound focus on different chocolate layers, which give the pie entirely new levels of depth as a dish. You can use pretty much any kind of chocolate you'd like, as the whole point of this dish is to dump as much of that as possible into one pie. Speaking of a pie that has ingredients so easy that just about anyone could make them, another one that fits that bill despite not being as widely beloved is the Jell-O pie. Now, the 1950s was a time filled with variations of different Jell-O recipes, and this pie was no different. All you need for this dessert are some graham crackers, whipped cream, and cherry Jell-O. You could sweeten the pot even more with some fresh strawberries, but overall, this is an incredibly easy dish to make that has seen a lot of mileage on America's cooking path so far. Jell-O had already been one of the most popular American snacks and desserts since as far back as the 1800s. And sure, we might now be very accustomed to seeing countless Jell-O recipes. What you may not know is that Jell-O pies walked so all the gelatin goodies of today could run, and that could not be truer than in the 1950s. Flavors like lemon, orange, and raspberry were also just as popular, and there was a spike in how many people were fans of Jell-O pies when the memorable chocolate flavor came out. The best thing about a Jell-O pie, which sets it apart from apple pies, is that it was as hard and complicated as you wanted it to be. While apple pies were easy to make and assemble, the prep was always the same and they had a fixed difficulty. With Jell-O pies, though, you could be looking at a 3-ingredient no-bake pie or a 10-step full-on dessert with whipped cream and flashy toppings. It was all up to you. Having that sort of creative liberty not only made it very fun to eat, but incredibly satisfying to make. Historically, the huckleberry pie used to be a huge part of Native American culture and cuisine. Before American settlers appropriated it, it was a dish they would make annually with simple enough ingredients like huckleberries, flour, cornstarch, a few sticks of butter for the filling and the crust to get a golden, crispy texture, sugar, and some citrus juice. You'd first prepare the crust, and for this specific pie, it's best to go with a traditional crust, then the filling, before assembling and baking it. The popularity of huckleberry pie died down in households as modernization happened in a post-colonial era, leaving this pie to fade into history with only some states ever looking to revive it. Cranberry pies were made with fresh cranberries that would be used in either purees or jam fillings, and were always typically featured in tart pies or alongside sugar fillings. Amping up the sweetness factor was what bakers were going for with the cranberry pie, and to sweet tooths all across the nation, the goal was definitely achieved. Even if that came at the cost of some of your favorite pairs of jeans not fitting anymore, the taste was just divine. It was worth it to splurge a bit, pig out, and devour a cranberry pie straight out the oven. A lot of bakeries specialized in this, and it was a moneymaker that drove this. To customers, if a place did not have a cranberry pie, it probably did not have anything else worth eating. Still, cranberry pies are not the litmus test they used to be, and nowadays they are a pretty old-fashioned pie that had their glory days long ago. Banana cream pies are exactly as good as you would think they are, and they make use of the freshest banana fruit available. Cream pie seems like something that's always been associated with American culture, but in all actuality, it only became that way during the late 19th and 20th century, when increased imports meant that America started getting a heftier supply of pies. The banana cream filling the pie made use of popular ingredients like vanilla, bananas, fresh cream, ingredients everyone not only had at home, but loved a lot. So really, it is no wonder why banana cream pies became a household special that grandmothers would often make whenever family was over. The real wonder is why the pie went out of fashion. I mean, all the ingredients are perfect and the taste is impeccable, so why lose a treasured pie? Even the armed forces agree with how great the pie is because in 1951, banana cream pie was named their favorite dessert on duty. Let's take it up a notch with some fancy pies instead of basic ones, and the cranberry chiffon pie does not disappoint by any means. Like a dish torn right out of a baking simulation game, with cranberry juice, oranges, egg whites, and more, this pie looks just a little better than it tastes. If the taste is a 10 out of 10, then we are dealing with a 10.5 in terms of appearance. Some things just go past your expectations, do they not? This was a pie you could find both in bakeries and in the homes of your family as you would visit. but there was nothing like a fresh chiffon pie right out of Grandma's oven. Oatmeal pie was pretty famous in the 1900s when it was often compared to a pecan pie, but with a filling made from oatmeal. This pie was popular during times of rationing and frugality, but became less common as more luxurious desserts became accessible. Now, there have been a lot of different and contradicting accounts as to when this pie actually first popped up. Some go back to the Civil War in the South Carolina region, which would place the pie's creation around the 1800s. The traditional makeup of the dish has not changed a lot, though. You'd need a 9-inch pie crust, 4 eggs, sugar, flour, grounded cinnamon, a dash of salt, some light cornstarch or syrup, a generous teaspoon of vanilla, some melted butter, and quick-cooking oatmeal. It was a pretty simple, healthy, and great way to spice up oatmeal back in its day. Crackers are more in style than ever before, and it's the breakfast of many people as it's a pretty cheap way to keep that appetite in check and those finances safe. Still, humans are humans, and cravings are something that gets all of us really badly. What do? People made up things like the soda cracker pie. It took these crushed saltine crackers and mixed them with basic pie ingredients to get a really firm meringue-like crust, which was then filled with fresh fruit and whipped cream. Strawberries and bananas were still available in that time, and people would even barter them in exchange for basic clothes or tools, so a family could get around to enjoy this every once in a while. So we will start this list off by paying respects to tradition, as our elders did much before us with their cooking. And what better dish for that than Southern possum pie? A graham cracker crust with sweetened cream cheese and pecans made for an incredibly earthy, crunchy pie that felt amazing to munch with every bite. The crust was to die for, and it made the pecans so much more appetizing than they had any right to be. Pair that up with some creamy pudding, 2 layers of chocolate and vanilla, and last but not least, topping it off with some whipped cream, and you have one incredible competitor for Sunday's lunch plans. Though we all know our grandmas would make too much for one sitting anyway. Cushaw pie with vanilla bean custard sauce. This definitely is one I hadn't heard about ever, and I'd be surprised if you did. At first it was like, what is a Cushaw pie? I honestly thought it was going to be some kind of dry, fruit-based pie topped with pecans. In reality, though, what you get here is a lot more similar to pumpkin pie. It makes use of cushaw, which is a winter squash, and is known for its hardiness. It's also completely native to North America, so early American settlers loved making this dish when they took it from Native American culture, which had already been pre-established in the area. Cushaw pie was a really common thing for the natives to make, as it made use of local agriculture and basic ingredients to give a sweet dessert. Spices, nutmeg, and cinnamon were the B team here that gave this dish its flavor and identity. Though you really needed to be careful about the mix, because too much of either of them would set the whole thing off. Then there's that delicious vanilla bean custard sauce. It's sad this dish isn't remembered because not a lot of things use vanilla bean custard sauces anymore, but it seems like such a good concept. That's my take anyway. What about you? Would you try to recreate this? This decadent black bottom pie was first found in 1870, created by a Swiss chef by the name of Felix Weidmann. The pie featured a rich chocolate layer topped with a creamy rum or vanilla custard. It was a hit in the mid-20th century, but eventually lost its allure to more modern chocolate desserts. The dessert first came to America in the early 60s with a famous professor of maths, Fred Bamforth, who always brought black bottom pie to gatherings. He would gatekeeper his secret recipe out of love for his wife. Still, he struck gold with a simple recipe. The pie was a great mix of milk, eggs, meringue, custard, vanilla, and some good quality rum. You can imagine, it was always a hit at the dinners. But as time would have it, this dessert also went out of fashion. A peach pie named and shaped after a luxury cocktail might be a little too rich for your blood or mine, at least on a weekly basis. So why not take a turn and look at some rustic cooking? Namely, a variation of apple pies known as apple and ginger stab pies. These are not so well known in the American cooking sphere, but they have some pretty strong roots in the culture. It was a common recipe in colonial America. The way this pie got its name is due to the method cooks used to check the temperature in those times. They didn't have any kind of oven or thermostat to work with, so they had to stab pies with forks to let steam escape and see if the pie was properly baked. The method was something that was common in every kind of pie, and if you didn't do it, you would end up with a soggy mess because of all the trapped steam. This was a really practical, pragmatic pie that got the job done for your immediate needs. Apple pies were already a really firm concept in American cooking, and ginger as a spice first became popular through the trade routes Americans had with Southeast Asia. They mixed both of these together in the 18th century, and people genuinely loved what they got, enough to adopt it into their everyday and weekly cooking, and this dish was really in its element back then. If we take a more modern look, we can see that it has massive fan bases in New England and the Mid-Atlantic, but it gets more traction across the nation overall during the fall and winter when apples are in plentiful harvest. Plus, people really love the warmth of ginger when it starts getting cold. It's one of the nicest and simplest heritage recipes you can find out there. Flapper pie. A grasshopper pie from the 1960s is not as easy as the other two we just went over, since it is based on a rather tricky cocktail even for bartenders with a good few months of swishing drinks around under their belt. The cocktail takes half an ounce of cream, with some white creme de cacao and creme de menthe. You would strain this into a glass, but you would not stop there. What people saw as a good drink, bakers saw as a blindingly obvious opportunity as they used the cocktail as the basis of no-bake pies with melted marshmallows and whipped cream. Poured into a chocolate crumb crust, baked and then chilled, grasshopper pies were a roller coaster for your taste buds and the perfect way to spice up any kind of evening into something much more exciting than you were imagining. They were an incredible party food, or an even better humble brag, and the chocolate crumb crust was just the kind of shake-up that Americans needed as people were getting a little tired of store-bought crusts and typical graham cracker crusts. The St. Petersburg Times in 1968 once were incredibly shocked at the amount of recipes they received for this pie when one simple reader asked for a recipe, and it made its first appearance in readable material when Gene Anderson dropped the American Century Cookbook. It was either that or the 1963 Gourmet's Menu Cookbook. Critics cannot exactly make up their mind as to when the pie first appeared in the landscape of America's bakeries. Despite it being so popular in the 1960s, did you know a lot of folks used to think it involved actual grasshoppers? Now that is one pie we are not seated for. Since we are on the topic of tropical pies, let's take a look at chocolate haupia pies, which were a pretty regular staple of Hawaiian cuisine. These also had their fair share of coconut-based goodness, as they would be covered with a coconut haupia layer that would be made using thickened coconut milk. Then you would just layer the chocolate into a pie crust and top it off with however much whipped cream you fancied. Next to hula pie, this is probably one of the most famous pies to ever come from the island of Hawaii, and even McDonald's had their own brief take on it, though it came nowhere close to the bangers you would experience from the locals. If you are one of the people who enjoys a good coconut-based dessert, then maybe try this one out someday. There is probably a good reason why it got so popular across America. Sugar cream pies were in a league of foods called desperation pies. Popularized during economic perils, sugar cream pies used very few and simple ingredients which made them accessible to just about any Americans. Sugar cream pies involved a custard filling that was not made with eggs, and at the top of it you would have appetizing cinnamon sugar sprinkled onto the cake. Since they used so little but fed so many mouths, you can imagine how good of a choice this was in hard times. Especially during the Great Depression, where even stuff like sugar and flour was hard to come by, but humans need to have their sugar rush needs satisfied. Pies like this one were a great way to do that, but they did not last much longer after that era, and by the 70s disappeared completely. The history of egg custard pies is as rich as the filling, so settle in while we unravel all this delicious baked treat has to offer. As is common with most things in America, it came from outside the country and got adopted by our great-grandparents into something that was fit for everyday home use. This time, we have the English and Dutch to thank because egg custard pies weren't a thing here, but over there, they had already been a well-established part of the cooking culture. One blessed thing about the hand of a passionate grandparent cooking for their favorite family members is that they always knew how to get the best out of the bland and boring. Things like apples were suddenly key players in cultural delicacies like apple cider vinegar pie, when before, parents would struggle to get their kids to even maintain eye contact with an apple for more than 10 seconds. Granted, these were sautéed apples with vinegar, vanilla, cinnamon, and a lot of time in the oven, but they were still irresistible. A good cinnamon or maple syrup was the perfect sauce to round this pie off and bring its full potential as an acidic but sweet slice of heaven out. Apple cider vinegar has been a popular hit in America for many decades now, and it does not look like the grandparents of today intend to change that. The grapefruit meringue pie was a rather unusual pie that never gained widespread popularity, but was definitely consumed in some parts of the country. We can say this because you could find it in cookbooks in the 1920s as an easy-to-make and delicious pie that many would enjoy. Though it could never gain popularity in middle-class and lower-income houses because of its requirement to always use fresh grapefruits, which were expensive in the 1900s. Its recipe was immortalized in cookbooks in case it ever found its popularity in later years. Created like any other pie, the ingredients were eggs, vanilla, grapefruit, pie crust, and a whole lot of patience to create a meringue. The wait time to create this pie paired with its rather expensive ingredients lead to this pie being ignored and forgotten. Sour cream pie is a lesser-known but really beloved American dessert, which goes all the way back to European immigrant communities, especially the ones from Eastern Europe. The best part of this dish is that it takes something like sour cream and actually makes a proper dessert out of it. It was first only something that would come out of German kitchens, and it had very little American influence. Sour cream in America, on the other hand, was largely just used in casseroles and such, maybe the occasional cake or tart. When these immigrant populations first came and made their homes in the Midwest, flourishing Eastern European communities in America meant that the country was getting an expanded, more global food palette. Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, anywhere you'd go in states like these, you would get sour cream pie. Some of it was plain, as in just a custard made with sour cream and sugar, but some of it was based around fruits like apples and raisins. Dishes like these are just the best, don't you agree? I really prefer raisins to apples, but you might be the opposite. The dish is built in a way that it could work for the both of us, and that's why most homes adopted the sour cream pie and stuck to it religiously in times of need. Sometimes a calm, non-volatile dish that can be spun a few different ways depending on basic stuff really helps. Eat. Are you a fan of the fall? The weather, the orange leaves, the scenery, and most importantly, the amazing food. One of the best examples of food you'd find ever. The mincemeat pie was a staple holiday pie that was quite popular, especially during Christmas. This will typically consist of finely minced meat, diced fruit, and liquid to preserve the meat's freshness. Now, the dish itself has been famous since the early 14th century. Mincemeat pie was an innovative way of making sure meat would last for a longer time without curing it or salting it. Since then, the recipe has gone through so many changes that there's a mincemeat pie out there for just about every kind of palate, not just for preserving meat. You could even find pre-made mince pies in the grocery stores once when this pie was at its peak popularity as a holiday special. Does this bring back any fond Christmas memories for you? Giuseppe Cipriani, a legendary bar owner and drink maker, Bellini cocktail. He made this in 1948 and named it after a Venetian Renaissance painter because the drink had an unusually pale color that was really similar to some of the painter's early works. The cocktail did insanely well, probably even far beyond what Giuseppe expected it to do. Even in the US, before and after the Prohibition, this was one of the most famous drinks you could get. The pie was something that happened as a part of a trend that took place during the late 20th century, around when the curtains were closing on the infamous 1900s. People were really into trying all kinds of fusion food, and they decided to incorporate cocktail flavors into pies to try and see the outcome. In a mad scientist-esque food experiment, they took a peach filling and sweetened it to the high heavens with Prosecco, or sparkling wines, and some even introduced peach liqueur into the mix to really give it that Bellini feel. It was meant to imitate the bubbly and peachy nature of the Bellini cocktail itself, which was a sweet drink that would put you in the mood for a couple more rounds. They did a pretty okay job of it, since nobody ate this without asking for seconds either. Yellow peaches were usually used, but any kind worked. It was honestly a lot easier to mess this up, but somehow people found a way for a pie to actually imitate a premium cocktail. Blackberry pies were a step in a different direction taste-wise than the rhubarbs and raspberry pies that usually dominated the 70s. People got tired of the typical fillings that came with most pies, and there was a growing love for blackberries and what they brought to the table, especially in states like Florida, Arizona, California, and Texas, which have pretty high rates of blackberry picking. Fresh, ripe, juicy berries would be used to make the most delectable fillings you could think of. While the phase of blackberry pies was something that did not go further than states where a love for the fruit was already there, they still rocked. We would love to try an authentic pie from the 70s, especially one from the kitchen of a grandma with a blessed baking hand. Here's something you can put on the menu for your next birthday, and it may even outshine the cake itself, literally and figuratively. Confetti pies have been a party since the 1990s that people maintain rather religiously, and that goes double if the party is for children. This is because of all the sprinkles used in the cake, which give it the colors of the rainbow more or less, or for a less imaginative comparison, the illusion of confetti, hence the name. The batter of this cake is either golden, white, or yellow to help with the appearance, and the sprinkles are mixed into the batter before baking so that when it does bake, they pop and spread out over the batter. It actually makes for a really cheery-looking dessert, and as you may have guessed, it takes a lot of vanilla to pull this off. You should definitely check your extract supplies if you are thinking about whipping this up. Confetti pies may have originated from Betty Crocker's original Confetti Angel food cake mix as an offshoot, but no one can really say who the first to do it was, since confetti cooking became its own niche genre with things like confetti cookies and cereal bars as well. This meant that everybody could enjoy a slice of this heavenly pie in any variation. This is most likely why this pie has had no trouble lasting through the ages. A favorite of not just grannies across the nation, but also George Clooney. Transparent pie raises an eyebrow because you hear the name and get curious, and that is why you come to the dish, but people always stay for the killer flavor. Nobody knows where the first transparent pie really originated from, but it has been popular in the South and Midwest in places like Mason County in northern Kentucky. It used the same ingredients as a water pie, but without the water, resulting in a richer, denser texture. Before you start wondering, no, the pie is not actually transparent. It probably got its name due to the heavy usage of vanilla that gives the pie its iconic essence. Or maybe our grandparents just went too overboard trying to make sure our sweet teeth were catered to. The Shakers were a group that believed in Christ rather deeply, and they came from England to the United States, where they made rotos in Ohio, Kentucky, and New England. They were pretty famous for their devotion to the bit, but they had a reputation that preceded that too. It was their practical cooking which really made heads turn, because it was all based on local ingredients that anyone could find on a budget, and the goal was to waste as little as possible. They had these communal kitchens and they used to share meals, so a lot of their recipes were things you could produce in a batch and easily make for an entire large group. One of those was the lemon shaker pie, which was one of the best imports of the US. If you were at a Shaker residence, then you'd always find a pantry stocked full of lemons because they got a lot of use out of this pie. The crust is simple, minimal, and straight to the point. There are no fancy decorations or unnecessary flashy ingredients in this pie. It's a down-to-earth pie that uses the entire lemon, including the peel. They mix the sliced lemons with sugar and leave it to macerate for many hours, which gives a flavor that you otherwise just can't get. I have to hand it to them. They really did excel in making full use of every part of a pie. Speaking of frugal cooking, dial it back to the Great Depression for a second with me. I'm talking about the heart of the crisis right in the 1930s and maybe the start of the early 40s. A lot of our grandparents had to go through one of the most haunting patches of history, the Great Depression, and they had to whip up entirely new cooking ideas to get by. One of these was the water pie, which created a buttery pie with the main ingredient being its namesake, literally just water. So actual ingredients for pies became so incredibly difficult to get, and people had to go weeks without what was once easily available comfort food. That was just the best case scenario, and the likely case was that people would not taste the pies of their childhood for a very long time. However, a lot of chefs came to the rescue of Thanksgiving dinners and birthday parties everywhere with the water pie. Just some water, sugar, and butter plus cinnamon and a store-bought crust was enough for this. Nectarine pie is probably something you aren't used to hearing either. Nectarines themselves are believed to be nature's offshoot of peaches, and the pie also evolved alongside peach pie, which is kind of poetic, I'm not gonna lie. In terms of flavor, you can kind of expect it to taste like peach pie, but not fully. This one's more acidic, and it has a way heavier taste. It's also made with a thickener in a flaky, heavy crust, so it's not exactly a light or airy dessert. The filling is made out of maple syrup and nothing else, and in places like New Hampshire, it's even a festival dish that people make to celebrate the maple harvest. Honestly, no one knows where nectarine pie really came from, but I can tell you that agricultural-based cooking, which made use of natural harvests and fruits that were native to the land, was something extremely common in the South. A lot of these dishes have deep ties to the South because there was a still strong tradition of farming and harvesting in the area, unlike the major metropolitan ones like New York and Washington, where street food and deli culture was more popular. Anyway, fresh nectarines were one hell of a natural thickener, but people would still add cornstarch on top for an even firmer pie. It's said that this dish is the pride of the South, and a lot of people actually preferred it to a typical peach pie since it was a fresh taste but also familiar. The Marlborough pie has an interesting history. Emerging first in England, the pie disappeared around the 1660s, with its only mentions being in English cookbooks. Almost 116 years later, these cookbooks were used to bring the Marlborough pie to life in America. It automatically became a popular choice for any sort of Thanksgiving celebration. The English and American version was prepared with a staggering 24 eggs, beaten until you could not feel your arm, some cinnamon, minced apples, and butter. It became a hit across the land of the America. It would not have its rise to fame last too long because the sheer amount of effort it took to create this pie would have bakers choosing to stock other treats instead of this. As pecan pies and cherry pies became more popular Thanksgiving desserts, the Marlborough pie faded into history. Similarly, grapefruit pie is an even lesser-known delicacy in America than blackberry pie. It's just that dishes which made a lot of use of actual natural ingredients instead of processed stuff and layers of thick whipped cream faded out of the general food scene. You don't hear too much about them anymore, even though they're probably a lot simpler and easier to make. That's how they got their name in times where modern conveniences just weren't there, you know? It's things like that which make them timeless and something you can enjoy anytime. I guess this isn't an all-natural dish, though, since it does make use of gelatin, which started getting popular in the 1950s and 60s onwards. Pecans and pies really became a fashionable mix when sawdust pie started moving into bakeries everywhere. Your typical dark forest chocolate cakes and lemon meringues were pushed to the side for a while, especially in the South. Crowds were going crazy for dried fruit pies, especially in the seasons of summer or autumn. Something about falling orange leaves and pecan pies just made so much sense that it was a vibe for that time of the year. Unlike Jefferson pies, which had a whole crew of dried fruits inside, sawdust pies were more focused. Graham crackers and some pecans made for one delicious pie, plus some states like Hawaii like to add coconuts too. Not the most popular of pies on this list, but definitely a top comfort food, at least some odd 50 years ago in the 70s. The shoofly pie was enjoyed in Pennsylvania Dutch country. It had a niche popularity since its inception in the late 1800s. It actually became pretty popular around the Pennsylvania area as a coffee cake and then as a popular choice for home bakers. It used to be a regular part of breakfast if you were from there. Bakeries usually served this in two types, with a wet or dry bottom, with the former having a thinner crust and a thicker outer layer, while the latter more so resembles a cake. Traditionally, both have to include molasses, but for people who aren't Pennsylvania natives, bakeries sometimes switched it out for corn syrup. With the introduction of newer pies and innovative recipes, bakeries started shifting towards newer pies. The chouflé pie became somewhat of a figment from the past. Today, we can only reminisce about this tempting pie as many bakeries stopped production on it years ago. Pie is the last one on our list. I have to say, it's been really interesting exploring all these different pies together, since there's a lot more innovation here than most people would really think of. I mean, maybe a fancy meringue, sure, but things like Bellini peach pies, vanilla bean custard sauces. The flapper pie continues that trend, but not in the way you think. See, for those dishes, their unique and premium tastes feel really on brand because of the technical aspects involved in the cooking and the use of fine ingredients. For desserts like the flapper pie, which just makes sure of graham crackers, cornstarch, milk, eggs, and sugar, you would expect a lot more of a homely vibe and flavor out of this dish. A cozy and calm ride that doesn't really do a lot of new things, but does simple and old ones really well. That's not what it is at all. The flapper pie came as a result of Canadian prairie kitchens, where this dish was commonly made. They had little access to any kind of fresh pie-making ingredients back then, but what they could do is make full use of what they had. That had to be things that were available in every prairie household, and graham crackers fit the bill down to a T. Mini pies from the 2000s were made for when you wanted a pie but did not want to deal with all of the effort, or for when you did not have the stomach or the fridge space for a full dish. Mini pies tend to be equal to 6 inches in diameter. You could pick these up for a couple of dollars, and mini apple pies with cinnamon were some of the hottest pie trends to ever grace America's memories recently. You may actually have grown up with these, as they were quite the hot topic in the 2000s, especially for cheat days. We all want to keep our deficit going, but sometimes a satisfied sweet tooth tastes a lot better than skinny feels. This pie definitely will make you feel that way, as you could just about turn any baked pie you have ever had into a mini pie. All you needed were tiny single crusts, and you could even make mini Jell-O pies. Think of them like the desert equivalent to pan pizzas or single patty burgers. Okay, maybe not burgers, but you get the picture. They were designed to be easy to eat and quick to make, and they fulfilled that purpose well. One of the things that made this dish such a people's champion was the need to chill it for a few hours, which meant that you could make it hours in advance with it still being fresh by the time you needed to serve. Speaking of the chefs of today, they have some pretty interesting differences when it comes to the modern take on a mincemeat pie. These days you see dried fruits and even rum and brandy being used in the dish along with various spices. No sign of meat anywhere, despite it literally being in the name. In the past, mutton or ground beef and raisins, nuts, pecans, seasonal dry fruits like these were all you needed to make an exceptionally lovely mincemeat pie. This pie has always been typically served at Christmas, but it took off so well in the South that many families would just have it as a weekly dinner too. Do you have any memories of a mincemeat pie from your childhood days? What kind of differences can you note between the pies of then and now? We sure see a lot of differences. Green tomato pies might take your taste buds for a spin, since you might have rarely heard of or tried this pie. In reality though, when made with summertime spices like cloves and cinnamon, they would take on a very fruity taste similar to apples or rhubarbs. In the 70s, green tomato pies were such a chic and in choice as far as your evening dessert plans went. Combined with their apple-like notes, they were called the apple pies of the summer in that decade. The 1970s had a whole spectrum of food, from experimentative train wrecks to simple knockouts. Green tomato pies were somewhere in the middle and did find a fan base, but not one strong enough to last into the new age of today. Pineapple upside-down pies do not work, but pineapple upside-down pies definitely do. Emerging in the 1920s, the pineapple upside-down pies were a lot more visually appealing than you might be imagining right now, and we do not blame you. Hearing your dessert comes upside down by default definitely raises some cause for concern, and at least an eyebrow or two. However, it would just be a pie built sort of in reverse. You had the pineapple as the base and cake batter poured over it, with nuts and maraschino cherries as toppings. Once this was baked, you would flip it to make the bottom of the cake the top, and that is where the name comes from. This cake would typically use pineapples and brown sugar, but some versions substituted those for apples or pears and powdered sugar instead. We'll stick to the traditional recipe today though. which actually made its first appearance in the 1920s when it was at its peak in terms of popularity. It started off its food journey with a Seattle charity cookbook that was called Pineapple Glace, first appearing in bookshelves during 1924. The second time the nation saw this odd cake was in 1925 in a women's magazine featuring a gold medal flower ad. It was a bright yellow dish with nice contrasting red cherries on top, so it was a feast for the eyes as much as it was for the mouth. It was also the perfect way to show off your cooking skills at a family gathering, plus the fact that you could make it with just canned pineapples made it extremely cost-efficient. Oatmeal caramel cream pies are something special. They weren't too common or as memorable as some of these other dishes. In fact, you probably haven't even heard of one until this video. But I'm going to show you why they got so beloved in the niche community they made for themselves. First, you have to ask, how did the idea of mixing oatmeal and caramel into a cream pie come into place? It began with the creation of the oatmeal cookie, which had already become widely available in America by the 19th century. Oat consumption in general was much higher in those times than it is today. While we might eat oatmeal for its value as a protein, people ate it back then because of the fiber and how it kept you full for really long. Anyway, the very first American oatmeal cookie recipes started in the 1800s. Then came Little Debbie, which was owned by McKee Foods, and in 1960 they introduced the oatmeal cream pie. It had soft oatmeal cookies stuffed into a sweet cream filling, and when that got old, they decided to take everything up a notch with the addition of caramel. Now it has two cream fillings. One was oatmeal and the other was caramel, and this was easy enough of a dish that you could get busy in the kitchen and even make it yourself. It may have been a little complicated getting the mixture of cream and caramel just right, but with enough practice, it was easy. This dish had the power to appease a group filled with people from all age groups, so it's definitely something grandmas kept around for a day where other dishes would leave at least someone unsatisfied at the table. The lemon chiffon pie is an incredibly popular pie all the way from the 1920s, and it rightfully deserves its place in America's Culinary Hall of Fame. The chiffon pie concept, which was first made by Monroe Boston Strauss in 1926, was mentioned in magazines like The Ladies' Home Journal because of how popular it became with housewives at the time. Monroe Boston Strauss was an acclaimed pie celebrity with the title of Pie King. He must have had a pretty good reason for going around and owning that, since the chiffon pie speaks for itself. And the addition of lemon followed suit pretty quick. The very first Strauss recipe took cornstarch thickened liquid and a dome-shaped filling, but many now grandmas turned it into their own brainchild as they tirelessly remade the pie, shaking up the baking scene in America until it became muscle memory. As time went by, though, this delight got replaced by the formidable banoffee pie and lost its charm amongst the masses. Now, speaking of fruits, America's never really been one for berries unless we talk about cranberries, which is why you may not be used to hearing about blackberry pie and how it takes a flaky double crust and creates an incredibly refreshing blackberry filling. It first got into the American mainstream because of old recipes of Native Americans using blackberries much before the colonial days. It's a sweet summer classic like nothing else. The history of blackberry pies actually ends up going all the way back to the European settler period, where America wasn't really established as a country yet. It got known for a few things: how simple it was because it took like 3 ingredients, how it used cobbler and blackberries together in the pie filling, and how it was one of the first pies to start using double crusts instead of the normal single flaky ones. It was something that became a huge part of picnic culture in the Midwest. And this pie is still a nostalgic memory of better and younger days for people who remember it. Now, icebox pies from the 1910s can be a lot of different things: chiffon pies and pudding pies, key lime pies, or a blind-baked pastry. There is a lot of variety to look forward to if you are fiending for an icebox pie, and banana cream pies technically come into this genre too. They are typically thought of as no-bake pies, and most use condensed milk or pudding, with crusts typically being made out of biscuits like crackers or shortbread, and for the especially sweet-inclined individual, vanilla wafers as well. Icebox pies really took off in the south of the U.S. In the 1910s, most households in the South were farming households, and for them, having constant access to electricity and refrigeration was uncommon, unlike those in the city. Naturally, that also meant that having a working oven at all times was more of a luxury than a guaranteed amenity. But pies were just as popular in the South as they were elsewhere in the nation. What people came up with as a result were icebox pies, which did not need to be baked and could be kept in an icebox, which was a common item for any Southern household. Since they were so diverse and convenient to whip up, they stuck around for a long while. Looking back at the icebox pies, many people felt they were a convenient dish to make for large dinners. This meant multiple households in the 1910s were enjoying icebox pie, a dessert that is a rarity today. Ever heard about what the best pie in America might be? The 70s were the golden age of pies, and there is no better way to find the perfect pie than to go over some of history's best. Maryland's classic white potato pies are an incredible place to start off our listas. They are some of the most innovative, simple, and tastiest dishes to come out of the state. All you need for this are some ingredients you will probably have in your kitchen already. This includes mashed potatoes, a few eggs, butter, and a crisp pie filling that makes for a savory pie that lightens up any dinner. You might associate your pies with nothing but dairy and sweets, but people in the South would mix and match a lot of savory ingredients. Eventually, they found out that not only do jam and custard go in a pie crust, but mashed potatoes do too. Just a bit of vanilla frosting topped off a dish that broke away from convention and left everyone's stomachs happier for it. Comfort food peaked in the 90s for people in Maryland when everyone had this in the fridge, but it would vanish just a few decades later from most households. Hawaii has always brought a peculiar taste to any local dish, and chocolate hopia pie is no different. A chocolate pie with a coconut cream frosting topped with whipped cream, giving it a really pretty, milky white appearance. Taste-wise, you had strong waves of chocolate mixed in with perfect little kicks of coconut. Lots of rich whipped cream added the consistency the dish was otherwise missing, and it left the pie with few flaws to speak of. People definitely thought so back then, at least. You could find this in states literally the opposite side of Hawaii, like Ohio and Texas. In chocolate hopia pie, you had something that did not completely disregard standard American tastes, but added a refreshing little something to make it more exciting. Presently, even in Hawaii, this is a rarely made pie as it went out of style. A sugar cream pie, or also known as Hoosier pie, maintained regional popularity in Indiana. This pie from the 1900s suffered the same fate that many other treats on this list did. When you think of this, start picturing a sweet creme brulee with a custard filling and some cinnamon sprinkled for good measure. Now, this definitely was a lot more popular back in the 90s because of how easy the Hoosier sugar cream pie was to make. From bakeries to households, mostly everyone would have a go at creating the sugar cream pie. With the pie being mentioned in many cookbooks from the early 1900s, we learned that the trick to getting that sweet, scrumptious flavor is letting the pie rest overnight. Many bakeries would create the pies and let them rest overnight so that they could have the best pie to serve the next day. This extensive and high-effort procedure was what led to the pie's downfall. Bakeries understood that extensive labor and waiting times for one pie was not reasonable. Slowly and surely, this pie started disappearing from shelves until one day it completely faded into history. Sliced sweet potato pie was often served with molasses, which got extremely common in the States as a whole during the World Wars and how they introduced rationing as a national concept. People got by on sweet potatoes and molasses rather exclusively, actually. It became one of those Southern recipes that just always gets handed down from one cook to another, and it was the talk of the town for ages. People loved to come into states in the South for a good sweet potato pie, especially during Thanksgiving. The sweet potato pie itself is actually something we can thank African American cooking for, because they were the ones who saw the natural sweetness of it and thought it would make for one delicious pie. It was also something you'd find in spades if you went through potatoes that were very native there. A neighborhood with a large African American presence. The sliced version came as a result of a focus on presentation, which again was in its baby stages as a concept. This was really popular in Central and South America because sweet potatoes were very native there. As far as the presentation went, they'd often cut the pie up into wedges and serve it that way instead of slices, which kind of made you feel like you were eating sweet potato. Sugar cream pie, Hoosier pie, a desperation pie. It has many names, but they all share the same glorious flavor. In case you have never heard of what a desperation pie is, it is just a baked dessert with simple ingredients plus whatever cooks had on hand that could complement stuff like butter, sugar, and eggs. However, this pie's custard filling was made without the use of any eggs, and it just took some flour and cream. It had one other name, which was the finger pie, and that nickname stuck around because of how cooks would stir the filling with their finger to avoid breaking the crust. If you have not had it, think of it like a chess pie, but it looks significantly more appetizing than that. Also, this was the unofficial pie of the state of Indiana. Lots of grandmothers and home bakers would regularly be whipping up a hearty sugar cream pie, and the large interest in it probably started from there too. Vinegar pie is really commonly associated with the Great Depression, but it was actually in the mainstream of America's lunch choices as far back as the 1930s, and it may have made its legacy even earlier than that. Most of the 19th century recipes used pretty simple ingredients to make an incredibly flavorful pie. These ingredients would be things like water, molasses, and just some flour and vinegar. With a recipe that is this frugal, you can definitely see how this came to be associated with one of the hardest economic patches of the country ever. But vinegar pies have been an American classic even when the bills are not breaking your back. People would swap out some of the ingredients for more fancier ones, like replacing molasses with refined granulated sugar. But most of the 1930 pies typically stuck to a very simple and straightforward game plan. Some people would use apple cider vinegar or top it off with cinnamon. But the former was less commonly practiced, as people thought it made the pie taste too much like an apple brown Betty instead of a sweet vinegar pie. Do you think you would like to try this? Since it is quite easy to make, it might be the perfect idea for a lazy Saturday. Are grapes not really up your alley? Have you ever tried a grape pie? This specific one actually goes back to the 1950s in Naples, New York, and the Finger Lakes regions, and it first went mainstream thanks to the efforts of Irene Bouchard. She would churn out unbelievable amounts of these from the 50s to the 80s, and we dare say grapes as a whole got some newfound respect because of her. Regularly, thousands of grape pies would be sold at the Naples Grape Festival, and their annual haul is around 20,000 grape pies. As you can tell, these people do not play about their grapes. Concord ones were the kind that worked best for this pie, and with some Welch's grape juice would go excellently with it, and the pie would be layered with pastry dough. It got popular enough with bakers at home, and that is the story of how Concord grape pies are a long-held New York tradition. If you go on over to states like Vermont, though, you'll find that the most common thing there was actually something called black bottom pie. This takes a graham cracker, a pastry crust, and a melted chocolate layer with a custard and whipped cream to give you one very heavy pie. It's known for its several layers of flair. First, you have your shaved chocolate and pecan toppings, then the custard, then the crust itself, before you get to the filling deep inside, which just oozes out once you get to the bottom of the pie. Some people used to call this a yin-yang pie because the base was pretty dark, but the topping was really light, hence why it got the name black bottom pie. It took bakers and Nestle chocolate to make, so home cooks found it really easy to get the core ingredients for this recipe going. Plus, it was like most cream pies of its time, in the sense that it had a custard or a thick pudding base that was then used as the filling for a pre-baked pie shell. This dish was one of the first signs of a big focus on aesthetic and presentation, which wasn't really a thing in the early 20th century. People wanted their food to look good, but they didn't really care about making a show of it or having any coordinated design themes. This dish went in the opposite direction, though, which made it really appealing for a lot of people to both look at and eat. The flapper pie was more popular in Canada, but it definitely found its footing in the US during the Great Depression. During this time, most of the ingredients for the flapper pie became pretty easy to acquire. If you want to imagine the taste, visualize a custard pie with a vanilla core that's topped with whipped cream or a complimentary meringue. You can also encase it in cracker crust. In the custard filling, it was common to use whiskey by some people who wanted to elevate the flavor of the pie during rough times. but mostly everyone settled with vanilla or lemon peels that added enough flavor anyway. Though by the 60s, the pie was largely forgotten because of changing economical situations and the emergence of newer desserts. Custard pies refer to uncooked custard mixtures that are put in a cooked crust and then baked together, and they were a pretty big hit in North America. Of course, you have the usual criminals when it comes to ingredients, such as vanilla extract and granulated sugar, but interestingly enough, many housewives opted for a dash of nutmeg too. Do not mix this up with cream pies as that uses cooked custard, and many pro-home bakers would make the perfect custard pie by making the most out of how eggs work as great bindings. Also, if you remember buttermilk pies from just a while ago, then it is also another kind of custard pie. Popular spins on the dish would see almonds being used or turning it into a bean or potato pie, but those are all from many years ago now. Similar to funeral pies, transparent pies also had a tacky name with incredible flavors. The pie emerged in the 1800s around the northern Kentucky region, where people had very few ingredients for a pie due to financial constraints. Still, the cravings were there, and they needed to be filled, especially if you had kids in the households. So people invented the transparent pie, which used the most bare bones of ingredients like flour, eggs, and butter. Fast forward to the 70s, and the case was still very much the same. Summer vacation, hungry kids, and an empty pantry. So what is a 1970s stay-at-home wife baker to do? Simple. Go for a quick and easy transparent pie which could not fail you, even with the limited ingredients and whipped cream made this a proper treat. People today definitely could not make a pie out of such little ingredients though, so the pie vanished. Since maple harvests are the topic, let's talk about the best thing to ever come out of them, which is maple syrup pie. It was something that people only associated with Canada, but now you'd find it in bulks and batches throughout bakeries in the US too, especially if you go to the northeastern areas. The reason this became so popular is because it took 5 ingredients max, the maple syrup, and then your typical assortment of stuff you need for a pie: cornstarch, flour, butter, and eggs. The maple syrup pie became extremely common in places like Vermont. Maple syrup in general is something that people always associate with the holiday seasons here. There's an extreme amount of maple syrup sales that you can credit solely to the large amounts people tend to buy during the Thanksgiving to Christmas stretch of the year. People tend to go all out on syrups and desserts during that time, since they like having something other than cranberry sauce to serve to the guests. It's also something that rises once fall hits because a lot of people feel like maple syrup matches the warm, slow, and cozy spirit of the season. Before we leave the South, let's talk about fried pies, which sort of blur the line between a fried pocket and a pie. Pie crusts that were fried and filled with various fruit or cream fillings became incredibly trendy in the South. Actually, most things battered and deep-fried tend to come from the South, so there really is no surprise here. Your mind might be thinking this would not work and that the flavors are too different, but it actually clicked. Folks from outside those parts of the USA also would pick these turnover like pastries, enjoying the harmony of fruits and fried dough. Fried pies gave people a similar feeling to eating a chocolate donut, since sometimes they would be filled with chocolate. Currently, it is just a forgotten Southern legend. Sadly, since America moved on to healthier pies. Let's start this list off with a spectacular example of the goodness that a well-baked pie can bring into a person's life. Of course, we are talking about banana cream pies, which marked the start of the 1900s, a century that would transform America in every shape and way possible, not just in the kitchen. Of course, us and even our parents are really used to seeing this simple pie, consisting of just a soft cream pie with whipped cream and bananas in cookbooks everywhere, but when did it first make its debut? That would have been in 1901 in the Woman's Exchange cookbook, which actually had you use a baked pie crust instead and involved powdered sugar. You would bake it further in the oven just to soften the bananas and really let them melt into the pie for a bit. But besides that, the recipe has remained rather consistent. I mean, why mess with what works, especially when it works so brilliantly? Banana cream pies have been a trademark of bakeries throughout America for a very long time now. They are also an extremely common choice for Easter dinners, lunches, and celebrations. But that is not the only place this pie gets a warm welcome. In 1951, It was also named the favorite dessert of the armed forces, so you can consider this an honorary veteran in its own right. Some people make it as a custard pie instead using vanilla custard, and they also put graham crackers in there. We would love to hear your take on this classic in the comments. Be very wary of what you see on the internet when you search for a Jefferson Davis pie. For some reason, a lot of traditional recipes out there have started leaving out literally everything that makes this pie special. See, a proper Jefferson Davis pie is an antique 1970s recipe for sure, but even in the earliest 19th century references in cookbooks, it is dried fruit pie. Jefferson Davis made with spices, dates, pecans, and raisins, very each thick custard filling. In different parts of the South, the concentrated bourbon syrup to go along with it also got popular, but the pie worked as it was too. People were a little hesitant to try a pie with spices. But as far as vintage recipes go, both in the field, this pie left no boxes unchecked. We are quite sad to see it go, really. In America, so many communities live together that often one will borrow from another, and such the case with funeral pies. Why do they have such a depressing name? Well, the pie was most often seen at funerals and was given to families as a consolation food. Most people agree that it got its name from how often they were seen at funerals. However, what we do know is that among the Amish community, these were not an omen of a deceased relative, but a sign of a delicious evening. Also, they continued the trend of spices and raisins being used in pies. Funeral pies eventually even made their way to southern USA cuisine, but today, even at a funeral, you would not find this. Dry fruit pies are making a comeback from their original glory days in the 40s and 50s, and back then, home chefs would use cornstarch, distilled white vinegar, and double-crust pie pastries in theirs. The generally accepted status quo was always a single-crust pastry, very light and delicate, but these ones were thick and required you to really bite into them. That made the eventual crunch all the more satisfying, though, and hot raisins were the perfect crunch to discover as your teeth went deeper into the crust. It made for an incredible experience both sensation-wise and with the flavor, and we hope that grandmas today bring it back fully. Rhubarb custard pie is the final one on our list, but this was one of the most perfect summer treats you could indulge in. And if you were one for rich egg custards or tart rhubarbs, then that applied to you even more so than the average Joe. Lots of housewives perfected their pie crust recipes as well as their custard-making skills to bring both together so that the end product was the most heavenly rhubarb custard pie you would ever lay your eyes on. Luckily, the recipe was always passed down too. Let's talk a little about that concept. Why do people pass down their recipes so rigorously? A lot of these recipes on the list are not just fun, tasty treats to make up, but a way of expression that is packed with fond memories for the people who were making them. And there is a lot of effort put into each one. There would be years of sweat and effort put into making it the incredible dinner it was. Rhubarb custard pies were no different, and even today, many families use their grandma's recipes. Bourbon fruitcakes had their fair share of dried fruit goodness too, except it came with a boozy twist. All of the fruitcake would be soaked in bourbon. While the essential dish that involved just candied fruits was well known in most states, it really took off in Kentucky. Over there, each neighborhood had their own style of bourbon fruitcake. Some people would soak it in whiskey and top it with a bourbon glaze. Others would keep the glaze but replace the whiskey with vanilla crumb frosting and use sponge cake. So you see, the idea got around and people had their fun with it. That just goes to show the boundless imagination of man to us, really, because we could not think of mixing bourbon with vanilla. However, even in states like that, this is mostly a very antique 70s dish that is not popular anymore. Good thing we mentioned beauty, since a tunnel fudge cake is a great example of a cake one simply cannot pass up on. Not in the same elegant and aesthetic way as a Watergate, but in a way that awakens your primal desires to consume food. A good, freshly baked tunnel of fudge could send people into a daze where their bank balance did not matter. Of course, there would be the little voices in the back of a person's head saying, "You don't need all of that," but the delicious chocolate aroma would take care of those pretty quick. Entirely a chocolate cake down to the last crumb, with a sweet choco fudge on the inside and a thick glaze on the outside. This was the dream. Bundt cakes like this one were already popular in the 70s, but the tunnel of fudge took the spotlight, but not for too long. As a few decades went by, these cakes became very outdated. Like apple walnut cakes with orange glazes. Now, at first sound, that might feel like a pretty odd mix of flavors, but just humor me for a second. Dried fruit like walnuts was foraged or purchased, since they also managed to escape the worst of the rising inflation. Foraging walnuts was a lot easier in areas where they were grown naturally, like California, so this cake took off with the crowd there. Floridians also used to get by on this cake a lot, so you can trust that you might find some use out of it too, especially if you're from those states. Back to the cake though, because there's a lot to talk about flavor-wise here. This cake used those and an orange glaze to make a really fruity cake overall that had a tangy, citrusy flavor profile, but a satisfying walnut crunch, along with the bitterness and sweetness of a nice, ripe apple. All in all, it's not a bad deal for the circumstances. Plus, in the guise of a cake, you were actually eating some pretty healthy fruits. The best thing about this cake was that it could stand on its own without any frosting or decor, and it could also be baked in one single pan. The glaze balanced the earthiness and bitterness of the walnuts, and the apples were right in the middle of the flavor spectrum, whereas the nuts and oranges were on opposite ends. This meant that you had a pretty well-balanced dish for almost no effort or money, and that was a godsend back then. Mocha whip cakes were more so the next hot thing in 1978 and started out as a niche trend particular in French-American restaurants. Young adults, book readers, and the romanticizing cafe-going types would always order a slice with their coffee of the day. Gold does not stay hidden in the dumpster for too long most times, and for these whip cakes that was the case. Mocha whip cakes went mainstream when more magazines began featuring them in the breakfast sections as chic and classy breakfast for the modern working adult. Advertising can go a long way, especially when it is targeted at you with the intent of making you feel special, but eating this cake did feel special. In America, it was hard for coffee lovers to find a coffee chocolate cake that did it right, and this was it. You can imagine the grief they had when it stopped being served in the usual spots past the 70s. Apple cornbread crisps were another really popular way of incorporating apples into an ingredient that has lasted many families throughout many droughts. Cornmeal is a staple ingredient for a lot of reasons, but you can sum them up by saying that it's always been there whenever you've needed it most. The Great Depression brought back the culture of apples, especially in rural areas and places with heavy farming land like the South. This used cornmeal to make apple-flavored cornbread, which was actually a pretty comforting dish to eat given the circumstances and the options available at the time. You could kind of call it a hybrid between a cobbler and a fruit pie, as the cornbread crust and the soft, spicy apples underneath definitely give off that feeling. Nope. As you can probably tell, growing fruits and vegetables in your own backyard became an exceptionally important fact of life. One of the other things that people became very fond of growing on a regular basis were grapes, like Concord grapes. This was especially true when you went over to areas like New York and the Midwest, which had a lot of strong potential soil-wise for home grapevines and grapeyards. Here's one that has a bit of a controversy on it depending on where you are from. The Italian cream cake did really well in the South. Pretty much every neighborhood had it up for dinner at Thanksgiving or some kind of holiday. Maybe their kid just passed an entrance test, or maybe they got a lease on that house they have been planning to move into. Point being, any reason was mostly a good reason to have an Italian cream cake. Outside the South, people sort of questioned the cream cheese frosting and had their reservations. Critics could not see how almonds and pecans could work together in a dish with coconuts as a base, especially with a frosting like that, but it was definitely still a presence in the baking scene in 1970s America. Back then, it had a niche following, and enough time has passed for that to have faded away long ago, so no one really remembers a legit Italian cream cake now. Atlanta has given us some great things like Donald Glover's hit Atlanta series, and also one beloved soda, which led to another cherished cake, the Coca-Cola cake. It involved a thick buttermilk chocolate cake and marshmallows which were topped with a cola frosting. Unusually, the cake was frosted while still being warm. You may think this is a dumpster fire of an idea and it tastes terrible, but you would be sorely wrong. In fact, most people were not able to tell Coke was even used in the cake. Talk about sneaky, huh? Honestly, the closest thing we can compare it to is a sheath cake, which has a similar recipe but a few things left out. Coca-Cola cakes were perhaps the best Southern comfort food on many, many nights, but people would eventually move on as different products and mixes came. Chocolate potato cakes were probably the best example of ingenuity as a result of a crisis. Who would have ever thought that mashed potatoes and chocolate could go together in a cake of all things? I couldn't come up with that with a gun to my head, and these people had bills to theirs instead, which is twice the pressure. If you look back into American cooking practices, though, using potatoes as a way to make the cake base more firm and dense was a common practice, and when other things like flour and thickening agents weren't available, this was due. Cocoa powder was also a lot easier to get than chocolate bars, so it took care of flavoring the cake pretty easily. One of the other rarer ways people got to baking cakes was to use potatoes as a base instead, and now you can probably see that I really wasn't exaggerating when I said that people used potatoes to get by. They made almost everything they could out of potatoes, and this cake used chocolate layers on top of a potato base to create a pretty comforting dessert that could pass around the entire family. Despite what you might think, the chocolate flavor was actually pretty noticeable and deep, and the potato flavor was barely noticeable. It felt and tasted much closer to a real cake than people would imagine. Speaking of things that are readily available and easily grown, I can't forget about apples and how much they helped in the 20th century. You could get them from local orchards, canned, and even in stores. They were still a slightly reasonable place. People made all sorts of dishes with apple. Pineapple pudding cakes were also just as easy to make, and the perfect thing to freshen you up on a hot summer day. If you did not feel like pulling out all the stops and making a pudding and cake from the start, you could always use packaged products. Pillsbury sugar cake mixes and instant pudding mixes achieved almost the same effect, really. It makes sense why this cake lasted a lot longer than others, because when a recipe is easy to make with grocery mart substitutes instead of proper ingredients, the crowds are going to love it. After all, it makes the dish really accessible to everybody. When people think of easy to buy and make cakes, they think of your typical chocolate cake. Pineapple pudding cakes, also yellow cakes, were mixed with pineapple juice and cream cheese vanilla fillings. Definitely one of the most revitalizing vintage cakes that we are sad to see gone. 7-Up cakes were these really fluffy and moist bundt cakes, or sometimes pound cakes, that started off in the 50s but really took off around 1970. You might remember the Coca-Cola cake earlier on this list, and hey, if one of them works, why not try all of those fizzy sodas? Baking cakes with sodas became a pretty common trend in the South, especially in places like Southern California, where they were childhood memories for many kids. Quick, easy, and cheap but delicious cakes that warmed your heart up with a nostalgia trip. In the taste department, these closely resembled lemon lime cake, but the use of 7-Up gave it a much more vibrant and bubblier texture. Baking and fizzy sodas were something people moved on from as the 21st century approached, sadly, and we do not really know if it was for the better. Grand-Père dans le Sirop might make you think you're ordering some real fancy pearl of French cooking at a restaurant, but it's just a humble French-Canadian dish that literally translates to grandfather and syrup. It's a really good dish that just needs some basic ingredients, like sugar, flour, baking powder, water, and milk. If some of these weren't available, then you could make do with the next closest substitute. And I know flour was something not every house could rely on having. The Depression made a lot of basic things get out of reach like that, but this was basically just dumplings cooked in a sweet syrup, and dumplings were something that the populace had more or less given up on seeing for a while, so this dish was a little ray of hope. In rural areas and French-speaking communities, this dish took small amounts of sugar and syrup and made the best use out of it, making a dish that could be passed around the entire family. Devil's food cake sounds incredibly intimidating and extra, and we would not blame you for thinking so. Maybe you are picturing a triple-layered behemoth of a cake adorned with skulls and a 3-headed dog. What you will actually get if you step in a bakery and ask for, "This is a dark chocolate cake," but not just any old chocolate cake. Devil's Foot cakes used to distinguish themselves in many ways from the standard. One of those was that they used much less butter and used more baking soda, giving it that classic mouth-watering look. Also, this helped for a much stronger flavor. Layers of deep, dark chocolate that took an idea as old as men skipping stones on a river to new peaks no one thought it could reach. Just goes to show there may be a lot more treasure if you look a little deeper. No matter how deep we looked, though, we could not find a place that does a great 70s-style Devil's Foot. I don't know if you've ever heard of a 3-ingredient cake, but a Pennsylvania Dutch funny cake is exactly that. It was one of the cakes that was known for its thriftiness and resourcefulness. It took next to nothing to make, only needing chocolate or molasses syrup and an unbaked pie crust. If you had any kind of flour or flour substitute and cocoa powder, that would work too. It was a bit of a celebratory dish at that time, since this one actually did take typical baking ingredients, but the result was worth it. It was a great cake to have on a budget, and it lasted a lot of households, giving them sugar rushes when they desperately needed them more than anything else in the day to survive. Mimi's tomato soup cake was an odd one. It used canned stuff like Campbell's tomato soup, which was thriving in the Depression since that whole period really helped put canned products on the map. It also used other things like replacing dairy in the recipe with other substitutes. Despite what you might think, it actually tasted nothing like tomato soup. It was more along the lines of a spice cake, and if I were to make you imagine the flavors, I'd say a good place to start is to picture a mix of cinnamon, nutmeg, and cloves kind of overtaking the general flavor, but having a dense and impactful kick in their aftertaste. You'd be surprised how many relief organizations like the Red Cross distributed this around too, though I'm still not really sure who Mimi was supposed to be. We are going to end the list with a show-stealing pound cake known as the Bishop's Cake. Extremely popular in many high-profile cookbooks, such as the Silver Palette Cookbook, this butter pound cake delivered a very vibrant and fruity punch to your taste buds. Most bundt cakes at the time came saturated with alcohol-based syrups. However, Bishop's cakes would instead focus on a much thicker and flavorful glaze. Also, in our opinion, anything that leaves a solid vanilla aftertaste in your mouth is an instant buy. While the trend of fruitcakes was still popular and rising in America, these cakes certainly dominated the wave. Everything has a beginning and an end, though, and Bishop cakes met theirs when more traditional vanilla sponge and frosting cakes replaced fruitcakes as the new baking MVP. People used this fruit to make things like ruby grape pies, since no part of the harvest was meant to go to waste. This became a pretty efficient pie to make when you were short on ingredients and couldn't afford the main selling point, which would usually be some kind of fruit. This pie was really popular in places like the Northwest Pacific and California. Places that had a pre-established culture of grape growing took a lot of advantage of it, and places like those even grew red grapes, which is what was used for ruby grape pies. Maybe that was self-explanatory, though. Anyways, one of the things you often hear about the Great Depression is how much everyone struggled to not let anything go to waste. Ruby grape pies particularly called for grapes at a specific stage of their shelf life, which is when they were really ripe, almost bordering on being too ripe to eat. This is why when the grapes did approach that stage, instead of wasting them, people turned them into a nice pie filling that had a vibrant color, a juicy and tart-like flavor, and some real stomach-filling potential. Dishes that looked and tasted nice were a real rarity, so people held this one close. Mayonnaise cake kept steering America into the direction of adding weird things to chocolate cakes and discovering later that they actually do work together. Mayonnaise cakes were these really moist, dense chocolate cakes that were not soft but heavy to bite. One of the best things to come out of Depression-era cuisine are cakes like this that require no basic ingredients like eggs or butter but can still be a knockout all on their own. Every underdog deserves to shine, you know? And mayonnaise cakes definitely had a very bright light. You cannot even taste the mayonnaise in the final product, and the additional topping of chocolate buttercream makes the whole experience a dreamy, solid 10. In our book, that is reason enough to get the baking gloves on and start the oven. But unfortunately, this stayed in the 70s, and people preferred cakes made with more ingredients when times got better. Speaking of baker bangers that had boozy beginnings, Grasshopper cakes were meant to mimic the taste of a grasshopper cocktail and were actually a pretty refreshingly new dish. People had options for cakes, do not get us wrong, but you know the menu on your phone can suddenly start to look stale when it has the same 6 things you have always ordered. Since like the past 5 months, and that is when cakes like this were people's new way to feel good about themselves on a Friday night. Grasshopper cakes had mint cakes that were layered with chocolate fudge and topped with mint whipped cream. It was not only really popular in general for bakeries, but also a holiday favorite. There would always be sales going on for grasshopper cakes with 10 or 20% off. Nowadays, you would not find this anywhere because mint cakes are not very trendy right now. You could always try making it at home, but an authentic 70s grasshopper was something else. I think if you had to circle out and pick one specific dish that best shows the kind of mentality people were under every day during the Great Depression, you would pick water pie. The name itself shows you how frugal this dish really is, and it's pretty true to the branding too. It just takes water, flour, and sugar, and if available, you can use butter and vanilla extract. A lot of people took notes out of mock food culture, which itself was a product of the Depression. People would try to make imitations of actual popular dishes, but since the ingredients were never available for them, and usually the goal was to make something that could feed the entire family, imitations using inferior ingredients or substitutes became popular. This pie didn't even really need eggs and milk, and it showed just how much people were willing to make do with whatever they had, as long as they got some food. You just pour water into a pre-baked crust and then mix in pretty small amounts of the rest of the ingredients because you still want to be saving. The taste wasn't as strong as it could have been if people were a bit more generous, but for what it was worth and how much the ingredients were stretched, it did still taste amazing. It was more of a custard on the inside than a pie, but it was definitely a way to have a pie craving satisfied back then. Raspberry Bavarian cakes were the pearl of any feast, with all eyes firmly glued to the cake's shine and noses pointed towards its ethereal aroma. You know when something passes you by and suddenly you forget the time and the conversation you were having? Your head just gets locked onto whatever whiff of magic just passed you by. People would often describe their first up-close contact with raspberry Bavarian cakes that way. Beautiful, but even tastier. They had a fluffy and melty crème anglaise base that had been folded multiple times in whipped cream. Raspberry Bavarian cakes were in cookbooks and magazines all over the nation in the 70s, and they were a way to make a statement, or to have one wedding cake you would not forget. We are definitely jealous of those who got to try a slice when it was in its prime. Cherry chiffon cakes hit a sweet spot for almost every American, whether under or over the age of 30, in both their worst and best times. An incredibly cloud-like cake that almost felt like biting into squishy air makes for therapeutic release, apparently. Cherry chiffons worked in any mood and situation. Getting married? Got your diploma? Had a baby? Moving out or celebrating a promotion? Won your divorce settlement? Whatever it was, this cherry-topped cake was there to make the sweet taste of it all even sweeter. Bakeries would usually sell these at pretty affordable rates too, so it was not anything that broke the bank if you ordered it. Heck, it was popular enough that it was a regular order every other day at most places. Those days are gone now, and Americans find that kind of personal comfort in much more different things today. Lazy Daisy cakes were made from sponge cakes, particularly hot milk ones, and would always come with a heaping serving of broiled frosting. Sometimes they were called snacking cakes, which tells you all you need to know about the cake. People had a very love-love relationship with Lazy Daisies, and as the name implies, it made them not want to get out of bed. A buttery yellow vanilla cake that was laced with broiled frosting was very hard to beat, and tropical elements like coconut flakes made it all the more refreshing. The frosting could be a vanilla one, but most traditional community cookbook recipes had a coconut and butter topping. Lazy Daisy cakes, true to their name, were easy to whip up in minutes and had you seated in one place for hours, slowly devouring every last slice. It is a crying shame that those are very far away comfort days from now. Potato candy is something you will never hear about today. I mean, what even is that? Candies and potatoes are on the opposite end of the spectrum. You've heard of things like candied apples. And sure, that makes enough sense, but what's the deal here? Mashed potatoes that were mixed with powdered sugar is where this baby starts, and it ends up creating a dough that you can roll out pretty easily. The real kick is that this dough can be mixed and filled with peanut butter, and you don't need any special equipment, trick, or kitchen appliance to do that. You just need a good old-fashionable potato and some sugar. Once your dough is filled, you just cut it into these potato shapes and bake it. I know what you're thinking, that it wouldn't taste like candy at all, that it would just be this weird potato mess that didn't hit and rather killed your appetite. Firstly, you gotta lower those standards because people in the Depression were not picky eaters. Secondly, it actually was pretty sweet. The potato was just used as a binding agent, not a main source of flavor. That was really just the powdered sugar and peanut butter that made this candy sweet and fudgy. Watergate cakes were another hit dessert in the 1970s, particularly in 1972 when the Watergate scandal occurred. A Watergate cake is a layer cake made of pistachio and often has mousse frosting, although it can contain other ingredients too, like diced pineapple and marshmallows. Despite its questionable political rep, it actually was popular enough in 1975 to increase shortages for pistachios all around Washington. That too near Christmas season, folks were baking. That many of them, but we bet you have never heard of a Watergate cake before. Sadly, it is a forgotten relic gone from tables nowadays. Modern-day Christmas cakes look like lots of ice or vanilla frosting, and the pistachio flavor is not too much of a hot pick in the baking industry. Still, we definitely would have loved to try a slice of this green-colored beauty. Earthquake cakes are not made from innovation born of scarcity. No, on the contrary, many critics and crowds were of the opinion that it often did too much. Similarly, for people who loved explosive combinations of flavors that bounced off of each other, this was nirvana. A chocolate mix base for the cake layered and filled with coconuts, pecans, and chocolate chips, as well as topped with cream cheese and chocolate batter. Yeah, that definitely sounds like a lot. We love our sweets just as much as the next person, but at some point it stings, you know? Despite facing some not-so-welcoming reviews here and there, earthquake cakes were pretty common in tropical seasons, particularly in states like Hawaii and Florida. Definitely a cake that is a bit too all over the place to have lasted the long haul, though. If you still remember, a while ago I mentioned how much love canned fruits had been receiving both as a concept and a practical part of everyday life. They even became something of a lifeline during the Depression because they were some of the most popularly distributed items you could get from government relief efforts or organizations. As a result, people started making dishes that made full use of all kinds of salads. Things like frozen fruit salads used all the canned fruits available, usually pineapples, oranges, cherries, or something like bananas, and then mixed them with mayonnaise or cream, eventually freezing them in molds in the final step. If available, a bit of sugar and marshmallow was also used for extra sweetness, but I wouldn't rely on most homes to have marshmallows back then. Anyway, this was a cheap and easy salad you could prepare in bulk that also gave the family a shot of some much-needed nutrition. Do not get the wrong idea because Americans have no real problem with cream cheese frosting, and cakes like hummingbird cakes prove that. Hummingbird cakes were a deeply beloved three-layered cake with a very smooth and buttery cream cheese frosting. Bananas, pineapples, pecans, and brown sugar were also used but contained in different layers. Due to the way it was structured with each section having a unique taste, the cake sold heaps. If you ever have had one, by the way, remember to thank Jamaica for doing the US a favor and giving us the recipe. They actually did it to promote tourism to Jamaica, so we guess it is a win-win situation. Despite having peaked in the 70s and being largely gone by the 90s, it was still known as the most wanted recipe in Southern Living's recipe in 1990. If you do not know, that magazine was and is a pretty big deal for chefs. Sock It To Me cakes were probably the vanilla lover's equivalent to a tunnel of fudge. Just like the former, everything about this cake amplified the sweet vanilla flavor. In the 1970s, buttery elements in desserts were really common, and most pastries, cakes, or desserts of any kind had heavy notes of butter in their overall taste. At the time, fruity flavors like rhubarbs and blackberries had taken just a bit of a back seat, and instead, others grew. especially flavors like vanilla and pecan. Sock-It-To-Me Cakes took those two tried and tested pillars of cake making and mixed them with a cinnamon streusel in the center. What you had then was a deliciously tender, moist, and rich cake that was perfect in just about any season and easily available. In the 70s, they definitely had a very memorable run, but as America kept changing its tastes, this recipe went in the closet. Spice cake also uses something that's been popular since before the 20th century and has helped America in almost all of its dark days. I mean it when I say this is a keeper, figuratively and literally, because people would often keep a stock of molasses just in case in their pantries. The just in case was for more tamer circumstances, like that odd week where you really need to pay the bills, so you cut some corners wherever you can. The Depression was really just that week played on a loop for years, so it's no rocket science that spice cakes became popular once again. They used things like cinnamons, nutmegs, and cloves, as well as molasses, brown sugar, and shortening or flour, to give the cake a pretty rich flavor. You didn't need fresh fruit or even canned fruit, let alone things like vanilla sauces and chocolate, which, let's be honest, as good as they sound, aren't the most practical items on the list. This spice cake was baked in a loaf or sheet pan, and it could be served to an entire family of 4 or more people. And it did the trick really well. If you could make a simple frosting or glaze from powdered sugar or water, then you were in for more or less a proper meal. The flavors here are also more or less what you'd expect. A soft but deeply warm combination of spices that doesn't overpower you but lulls you into a nice, dense sweetness. That weight in the flavor is from the molasses, which are usually described as being a heavy presence in whatever food they're in. Which pie was your favorite? Let us know in the comments, give us a thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe for more delicious content.